Well, good morning, and welcome to Sunday School. Good to see you all here this morning. We are ready now for our second lesson out of 5 on the English Bible. You should have a handout. Malachi is running around handing those out. If you're watching this online, we do have that up on the website too. Let's see here. Last week, we reviewed some things about the basic content of the English Bible. What's in it, how it's laid out, what kind of chunks it occurs in, a little bit about where it came from, what's not in it, some of the things that could be and aren't. This week, I want to take a look at where the English Bible came from, the very earliest steps in the English Bible. We did a little quiz last week, and I think somebody got the answer right on when the Bible was first translated into English. Anybody remember that? 14th century, which is the 1300s. Yeah. Good. I'd like to spend just a little bit of time with you on the Greek precursor to the New Testament. This is a kind of a fun little chart. It shows the development of manuscripts of the Greek New Testament up until the time of the printing press. If I start with that top bar, the first section is papyrus. Then the writing material shifts to vellum. It's kind of like leather, except it's super thin. Parchment would be another name for it. And then eventually, around the 14th century, 13th century, it shifts over to paper. And you'll see there's a slanted line because none of those were a hard and fast shift. It took some time to shift from one to the next. And so the earliest Greek manuscripts we refer to as papyri because they're written on papyrus. You bet. Yep. I don't know if this bar is all that interesting, shifting from a reed as a writing utensil to a quill, a feather, which some of our ancestors in this country used, as I understand it, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. The book form, there's a little speculation that there may have been early use of the roll or a scroll, but we haven't actually found any New Testament manuscripts that were written on a roll. Every one that we have found has been written on a codex. It's like a paged book. And that was a fairly new invention at that time. And I think it's kind of fascinating because it was Christianity and the adoption of the Codex, the book form, as a writing platform that popularized it throughout the rest of the world. When the New Testament was first written, almost all literature was written on a scroll or a roll. And for some reason, we don't know exactly why, it appears that the New Testament authors adopted the paged format for writing their letters. And that then was copied and used for the rest of the New Testament. There have been books written on that question. Why did Christians use the Codex? We know that they did, but why? It's not intuitive. But I think I've said all I want to say on that. Then the bottom bar has 2 different kinds of handwriting. The first one is what we would refer to as a majuscule or an uncial It's like capital letters, and they're all distinct. And then the second grouping is a cursive, which we would refer to as a minuscule, where the letters kind of flow together. And we would kind of call them a lowercase letter as well. So up until about the 10th century, all of the ancient Greek manuscripts were written in the caps where each letter is distinct. And then right around in the middle of the 900s, it shifted fairly quickly to that cursive minuscule handwriting. It's a lot harder for us to read. If you're a new Greek student, you'd look at that and just shake your head. But once you learn it, it's very quick to read, and it was quite a bit quicker to write. Cursive in English is a lost art, I think. But for those of you that know cursive and learn cursive, you know that it can be a lot quicker than writing print.
Ever get the word minuscule? Like something tiny?
Yeah, they're related.
Okay.
But this is not a typo. It's minuscule is the way what this is referred to. I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is, but yeah, they're obvious. I want to show you some examples of these. So the three basic categories are the papyrus, and those run up through about the 3rd century, although there's a trickle that are later than that. Then there are what we refer to as the uncials. That is written on vellum, but in the caps. And finally, we have the category referred to as minuscules. This is a page from P46. It's written on papyrus, and it's written in a caps, a majuscule handwriting form. You can make out the unique letters there. It's not run together. This is perhaps one of the earliest that we have, P52. I mentioned it last week. It's only about this big, just a little bitty scrap. And it's got front and back parts of the book of John. There you see chapter 18. And you can see I colored the text out of the full page so you can tell about where it's at. So those are what we refer to as papyri, written on papyrus in this large individual letter script, caps, if you will. 4th century, perhaps about AD 350, we have our first majuscules, and they are written on parchment vellum leather that's been scraped super thin. I should have brought some pieces to hand around. I zoom in here just a bit, and again, you can tell it's just line upon line of letters. There are no punctuation marks. There are no word spaces or word dividers. Every once in a while, there's a break in a line, almost like a paragraph break. No accents, no breathing marks, just straight text.
So do you have to just write all the letters out and figure out what the words are? Yeah. If I had more time, I could have you try this in English. You'd get most of it. Okay.
Every once in a while, there's a case where it could legitimately be divided in two different places, and it's ambiguous. Did he mean this or did he mean this? Because the letters all run together. You could cut it here or there, and both readings would make grammatical sense. That doesn't happen too often, and it's usually with little bitty words or the ending of a word or something like that. But yeah, you'd get pretty good at it. Rabbit trail. This is one of the reasons why in the early church literacy was about 10%, we think. And so a person was assigned in a church as a reader, would take the text home with them and practice reading the assigned portion before coming back and reading it publicly. And you can kind of see why. it helps it helps me with my English to read ahead of time. But to get the right emphasis on the right syllable, it's important. Thank you, John. He caught that. Yeah. This is just kind of for fun here. There were some manuscripts in the 6th and 7th centuries that were gorgeous. Now, this is quite old at this point, doesn't look pristine, but they would dye the vellum purple and write with ink that was silver or gold. They're absolutely, I can't imagine the expense of creating a document like this either, a New Testament in this form. Sometimes I'm a bit envious, wishing that I could have something like that in a language that I could read well. And I probably could if I had enough money, but to get somebody to handwrite something like that for me. So some of those purple manuscripts, the color's a little odd here, but also some of these were beautifully illustrated as well, which is kind of fun. And of course, none of that is printed. It's all done by hand. Let it dry out before you add the next color. So some really, really gorgeous manuscripts there in the late Byzantine, early medieval period. So those are what we refer to as majuscules. And then we have minuscules. This particular example is from the 13th century, so the 1200s AD. I like that one in part just because it's got a gorgeous illustration with it too, but a lot of letters that are connected, not every one. In some cases, actually two letters combined to make a single, we call it a ligature, a single sign. And if you don't know what that sign is, that it's a combination, for example, of omicron and upsilon, it looks like something from outer space, even when you know Greek, New Testament Greek, until you figure out what some of those are. But once you figure it out and become a little more comfortable with it, it's not too difficult to read. Clearly handwritten. It would be virtually impossible to reproduce this in a printed, well, with typeface or on a computer, because every set of letters is a little different than the one before. Here's another example. I think we may have looked at this last week as well. This one has the text is the major portion here, and then we have some commentary, probably a sermon, surrounding it over on the side. Let's see, I've been talking so much I forgot to look at my notes. Anything I didn't?
Kris, which part of the Bible is that one?
That's the beginning of the Gospel of John. The Evangelion Kata Ioannein, the Gospel according to John. That's a fascinating subject too. Where did these book titles come from? So I'll guarantee you when John wrote his Gospel, he didn't begin with the Gospel according to John. Somebody added that in there. And you see variation, quite a bit of variation in manuscripts, and it develops more as time passes. We get longer and longer titles for the various books of the New Testament. The Gospel according to St. John, the Gospel according to St. John, the beloved of Christ, or it develops its own tradition. Just briefly here, the way books were made, and this is Papyrus Books initially. Papyrus, it's a plant. The stem, they peel off the outside, you get kind of this woody inside. They pound it out to flatten it. It's got sort of a natural glue. They lay a bunch of strips this way, lay a bunch of strips that way, and come out with a sheet, let it dry, glue a bunch of sheets together, and end up with a roll of papyrus sheets, like a single And in classic literature, that is what they would use then. They would write columns of text on there as they scrolled across. In book form, a codex, they would cut it back into sheets and then write on there, and it got a little bit complicated. Well, it would depend on how you did it. You could do a codex of single folded sheets, so you just write page, 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 page. But then somebody came up with a brilliant idea of what we use today, stacking a bunch of those and folding it. Except if you start writing, once it's already sewn together, you have to fold it flat, write on it, and you can't immediately turn. So then they had to divide it up and figure out how much text can I put here, and do the beginning of John here and chapter 13 over here. Set that aside to let it dry. Get the next sheet, John chapter 2, John chapter 12. I'm generalizing, but it got to be kind of complicated. And then, to help ease that process, they added page numbers. So we actually see page numbers. It helps the scribe and the guy that sews them together be on the same page. And there are mistakes as we go along, but and then just because I can throw it up there, these are the rough sizes of papyrus sheets. This is a 8.5 by 11 notebook sheet for comparison. So they came in all different sizes and shapes. Next week I have a couple of Bible pages laid out one-to-one that I want to show you to give you some idea of how English Bibles were sized when they began to appear. I gave you a copy of this on the back of your handout. There were a whole bunch of other versions that were translated before English. We think one of the earliest was, well, there were a bunch right around the start of the 2nd century. Aramaic, we have some very early copies of that. Syriac in the 2nd century. And Latin had to be one of the earliest as well. There was an Old Latin, which was the first run at translating the Greek New Testament into Latin. And then in the 4th century, Jerome got tired of messing with the stuff that was out there and did a brand new translation into Latin that became known as the Vulgate. And that then became the standard Latin text. And why is that important? Because the Catholics are still using it. And it was the Bible of the church for centuries. Jerome's Latin Vulgate. And that's still what's read in Catholic churches essentially today when they read or do services in Latin. Let's see here. Just because I like maps, you can see some of the areas here. The green is Latin-speaking country. We have a bunch of Slavonic languages here. They were a little bit later, of course, than the Latin. We have a couple of Egyptian-type languages, Coptic, a couple varieties of that, the Bohairic and the Sahidic. Armenian was a very early version as well. The Syriac would be up in this area. Greek in a number of different places. And I tell myself here that you can look at your handout to see the rest of them, so if you're curious, they're there. I threw this one up just because, so you would know what it looked like. I can't actually read that up there, but hopefully it's legible on your handout.
Aww.
Right? You got a handout, right? Okay. The earliest efforts at translating the Bible into English were translations not from Greek but from Latin. And the very earliest efforts at that we are aware of are in the 7th century. Now, that's a long time before we actually get our English Bible. The example that I've shown you here is the earliest one I know of that I could actually get a picture of, coming from the 8th century, so that would be the 700s. And it's a Latin text, but if you look, you can see a couple of English words, Old English words, written in as a gloss. What does that Latin word mean? So I suppose it would kind of help somebody if they were trying to translate to an English audience on the fly, or somebody was like, I don't know that Latin word. Except I said that well, they may have said that in English, in Old English. I don't know how you say that in Old English. Old English is weird. I speak English, but not Old, and I really struggle with Middle. It's like a different language. This is the Old English Wessex Gospels, about 990 for a date, and it's Old English. This, what you're looking at, I've been told, is the beginning of the Gospel of John. We do actually have a little bit of Latin up at the top. In principio erat verbum, or something like that. But then the rest of this is English. Can you read it?
No.
Me neither.
Is that is like old English? Yeah. What English professors would refer to as Old English. There are occasional pieces in there that I think I can recognize a word. Part of it's the alphabet, the script that's being used, and they're using characters that we don't use anymore either. So somebody back around AD 1000 translated the Gospels into Old English. And they didn't do any more than that we're aware of. But this is a reprint of those Wessex Gospels as an interlinear. The classicist 17th century, somebody did this. And thou, our Father, which art in heaven, that's what this is supposed to say too in Old English. And I struggle to see the connection. There's that much difference between Old English and, well, early modern English. The first full translation of the English Bible was into what we would refer to as Middle English, and it was made by John Wycliffe. Not just him, he's got his name on it, but he had a bunch of students that helped him with it too, him and some of his co-workers. He was born in 1324. He studied at Oxford, and then he began this translation work in 1376. Like the translation attempts that had come earlier, this is a translation from the Latin. It's not a translation from the Greek or the Hebrew. He realized, even as he was doing this, that the Pope would not approve. The Pope was the head of the church. So he had to be a bit sneaky with it. And a lot of the copies eventually were destroyed. But keep in mind, every one of these is handwritten. There's no printing press yet. I wish I could say my handwriting was that nice.
I think some of this is actually legible to us as Middle English rather than Old English. Can you make out the blown up one there? Yeah, keep going. Yeah, yeah. Was the Word.
The same was at the beginning.
That's kind of fun, isn't it? Yeah. Because you can, like, sort of make some stuff out. And it gets even easier if you know a couple things. Okay, in, that to me looks like ye. However, that first sign that looks a bit like a Y is actually called a thorn. And it makes the TH sound. We don't have that letter in our alphabet anymore. It's dropped out. And we've added some others. Well, they didn't have a letter J back then. They didn't make the J sound. No. So like, I'm sure it doesn't say Godzilla. I know it looks like it, but that's, you saw it there too? Okay, so what does it say? This was in the beginning at God. No, that's not Zilla. All, that's an A-L-L-E. All thingies were made by him. Okay, so you do have some abbreviations as well. This is him, and that overline, that was a common Greek abbreviation at the end of a line. So it's not too surprising to see it there. Yeah, we do have an ampersand as well. So, and once you figure out some of the letter shapes that are a little weird, it begins to become more clear. A little. English is so funny. They completed the work of translating in about 1382, and so that's the date that we always associate with Wycliffe's Bible. They did a second version in 1388. Again, every copy of this had to be handwritten. It would be another 70 years or so before the printing press was invented, roughly 1450. This Bible was condemned and burned in 1415, but about 180 copies of either the whole or part have survived, most of them dating before 1450, before the time of the printing press.
So, what was the Pope's problem with the English translation, seeing that there have been dozens and dozens of other translations?
What was the Pope's problem with it? Well, he couldn't do anything about the stuff that had happened centuries before him, translations into Old Germanic or Syriac or Aramaic or those kinds of things, Coptic. I mean, those were history. This was within the Pope's kingdom, his area of control, the Western Empire, and I think it really was a control issue. You've probably heard that any number of times. The Catholics eventually came out with an English version. We typically refer to it as the Dewey Rhymes version, based on the names of the two guys that compile it for the church. But it was quite a while in coming. And when it did arrive, it had some pretty serious theological bent to it. This was out of his control. And now all kinds of people that have no training in the church or in theology can read the Bible. Whoa. Right? We don't want that happening. Well, there were those that didn't want that happening.
Well, then they knew they were being lied to. The people could read for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. All of a sudden.
They realized they didn't have to pay money for salvation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, it would. So that would be my answer, Rick. I think it was a control issue, quite honestly. Again, beautifully illustrated. I mean, if you're going to take, not every page is like this. Many pages are just plain text, but certain pages, like the beginning of a book or that kind of thing, were gorgeously illustrated. Again, by hand. Some artist sat down and did all this artwork around here. And again, I kind of would like if my Bible had some of that in it, some of that beauty. Give you a little closer look here. I realize that's a little bit small. Anybody figure out where that's at? It's the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. So we have, jump right into genealogy. T-H-E, the book of ye, the generations of the Christ. What's the red ink? I could make out Matthew there. The beginning of, and here begins the gospel. A little bit of an intro. It's not the words of Christ. Yeah. And you misspell it. Yeah, no, they would usually erase, attempt to erase. You can do a fairly good job of erasing on vellum like this. Sometimes you can wash it off and maybe a little scraping too. So, just for a future week, one of the funny things we'll see are mistakes made in the printing press. Those are kind of humorous because people would attempt to come back and fix those too. Sometimes line it out, which is really ugly. Sometimes paste a little piece of paper over it. I'll show you a few of those. I see that hand now.
You said that this Bible was burned, but we had 180 copies.
That survived.
So, of that Bible, not the original. So they copied it 180 times, and then we lost the original. Is that correct?
No. Okay, thank you. I didn't communicate very well there. We don't know how many copies of this were made. Certainly hundreds, maybe thousands. Again, all by hand. But they were making a concerted effort to get it into the hands of English speakers. And then the Pope came down and said, nope, in fact, we're going to confiscate them and burn them. We have no idea if we have an original. We probably don't. Probably all 180 that we have are copies. But out of however many there were, 180 survived. So presumably most of them were burned, destroyed.
Is it 180 total books of the Bible, or is it pieces of the Bible?
I couldn't tell you the ratio, but a lot of them are complete Bibles. Well, some of them are complete Bibles. Some are bits and pieces, and they're scattered across the world in various museums, libraries, things like that. So you can actually, if you're interested, you can buy a page out of a Wycliffe Bible online. It'll set you back a little ways. But, you know, somebody comes across a partial copy that doesn't have the value of a complete Bible, and they're like, okay, I paid $15,000 for this, and if I sell page at a time for $500 a piece, I come out ahead. So that happens.
Are they still being discovered?
Still being discovered. You know, it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me. I wouldn't expect there to be a bunch more. But yeah, we find all kinds of documents that we thought were lost, and somebody finds it in an attic or in a library basement or an archive or something. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if there were still some discovered.
Where where did they find these 180 copies?
Oh, that's impossible
I mean,
to
was it
say.
in Europe? Was it in the Middle East?
They were copied in Europe. There were copies that were squirreled away in Europe. In a monastery, in a church archive, or a basement in some rich person's attic that happened to have a copy. Various places like that. Yeah.
So there were a lot of English that didn't follow the rules.
And a lot of English that didn't follow the rules.
Became American.
Eventually became Americans. Oh, John. What to say about that guy? Another page. This one out of the Old Testament. I'm not going to take the time to read that with you. I already mentioned the use of the letter thorn, and they had a couple others too. The ash, which is the A and E combined. You still sometimes see that in maybe more in British spelling. That's why you sometimes see, even today, somebody that wants to look antique, and they'll put ye olde bar, ye olde saloon, ye olde whatever. They don't understand that it was actually the, using a thorn. It never was ye olde whatever. Misunderstanding of English. The letter S had two shapes. The one that looks like an F, we call it a long S. They still use that in Germany today, by the way. And a number of contractions like the ampersand, they use that a lot, where you won't see that in a modern English version. They didn't have the letter J. That developed out of French quite a few years later. So you can think of all kinds of names in Old and New Testament that start with a J, right? So what did they do? It was an I, Jesus for Jesus, or Johann for John, or Jeremiahu for Jeremiah, or something like that. English is funny. And spelling was not standardized, and you may have noticed that already here. That didn't happen basically until Noah Webster, ish. So you could spell however you felt like. And even in the early versions of the King James, you'll find variations in spelling that are used in order to bring the line to the edge of the column. We've got a little extra space here. Let's spell it this way instead of that way, so we have nice straight edges. So
We're kind of going back to that.
today, yeah, we are kind of going back to that, right? Texting. I think I know what that means. If I sound it out instead of reading it. Yeah, that's funny. Okay. What was the benefit of Wycliffe's work in bringing us the very first English Bible? Well, exactly that. For the English-speaking world, they now had the Bible in their native tongue, if you could access it, if you could get to it. And I think a lot of memorization took place from that version. So it goes beyond just those that can read it. And that had an impact that was even broader than the English-speaking world as well. Some of the drawbacks, because obviously we had a bunch of versions that came after this. It was a translation of a translation. Okay? So the Bible was written in Hebrew and Greek, and then translated into Latin, and the Latin was translated into English. And that brings its own strange things. For example, Latin has no article. An article is like an or a or the. Latin doesn't have anything like that. Greek does, and in fact Hebrew does, but Latin doesn't. So when it gets translated into Latin, all the articles get stripped out because Latin doesn't have them. So then when you take that and translate it back into English, where do you put articles? Should it be a word or the word. Well, in Latin, it doesn't differentiate between those. Should it be the Spirit or a Spirit? Well, from Latin, you can't tell because there is no article. So there's some weird ambiguities that pop up because of that sort of thing. And in addition, some things that may have been a little bit ambiguous, unclear in the Greek or the Hebrew, when they get translated into Latin, they're made clear because the translator has to pick what does that mean. And so then if your English is based on the Latin, you're only seeing what that translator thought this should mean, right? It's not ideal. It's better than nothing. Beats a stick in the eye, as they say. And then, of course, there are a variety of nuances and shades of meaning and things like figures of speech that are difficult to communicate and sometimes get lost in translation. You might even be familiar with the very first ESV that came out. They translated this one literally, that speaking of the Israelites, God gave them cleanness of teeth. You're like, what? It doesn't communicate in English. I mean, I know what all those words mean, but the metaphor in Hebrew meant they were starving. And now that you know that, you're like, okay, I can see where that would be clean teeth. I'm not eating anything. But it's a word picture, a figure of speech, a metaphor that we don't use in English. So what does a Latin speaker do with that? And then we're going to translate the English out of the Latin. You can see how you could lose some stuff in translation. So it would be preferable to go back. There's a common one in the New Testament that where Paul especially speaks of bowels of mercy. Splankna, it's like your guts. They didn't speak of the heart quite like we do today, and that's usually it's translated put on a heart of compassion or something like that in English, but the literal Greek there would be bowels. Well, that's kind of weird, right? So then the question is, how did the Latin handle that? Did they have that figure of speech, or did they make it into something else? And then, of course, English dovetailing off of that. And, of course, for us, the Middle English is extremely archaic. I mean, there's parts of it we can make our way through, but we needed something more up to date for modern English. Just a little bit of what I find to be interesting trivia. About 700 languages today that have a full Bible. About 3,400 languages have access to at least one book. So there's quite a bit of work to do. About 1,500 languages are not known to have any work at all. Any kind of work in the Bible in their language. There are more than 450 English translations of the Bible. I know you could probably name half a dozen, maybe a dozen if you sat down and really worked at it. And a lot of them have gone by the wayside in past centuries. But we have a rich heritage in the English-speaking world when it comes to Bible. Wasn't that way always, but we have a lot of folks that have done a lot of work. We can, at will, pick half a dozen translations and compare them. How do people translate this? I'm struggling a little here to understand the meaning. Not every language can do that. In fact, there's still a fair number that have nothing at all. So, something that makes me thankful for what we have. Just a couple points to ponder. In the overall scheme of things, the English Bible is a latecomer. We are not one of the first versions to be translated. 14th century is a long time ago for us, but it's not nearly so ancient as what you find with some other languages. On the other hand, we have a really active tradition of Bible translation. over 600 years, and it's one of the most active still today. And I really think that's something to be thankful for. It's something we can take advantage of. It's a benefit to us without us even having to work. We can just go pick it up. Somebody else has already done it. Somebody else has already made it, done all the work for it. And I think in some ways God has used that to impact many other parts of the world. A lot of English-speaking missionaries and translators that have been able to take advantage of the work done in English, helping other language groups as well. Okay, I'm done. Any questions before I close?
I just wanted, you said they started translating Latin in the 7th century. Is that?
Oh, Latin was much earlier than that.
Oh,
Latin was like 2nd century,
okay.
maybe even earlier.
I thought you said they started doing a lot of translations in the 7th century. But you said it was the 2nd.
2nd, yeah. And then Jerome in the 4th century, that was the mother of all subsequent Latin. Yeah. Good. Glad I could clarify that. Let me close this in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you so much that we have your word in English. We're grateful for your people who have faithfully worked to bring that to us. I pray that we would be quick to take advantage of that by reading your word and familiarizing ourselves with it so that we can become steeped in it and ultimately, of course, be obedient to it. Thank you for your love for us, and pray that you would strengthen us to be good servants of yours. In your name, amen.